So let's take a look at some hand sewing stitches that we can use to fix a seam on the fly. I have 2 pieces of muslin here, 9 inches on grain, 3.5 inches on cross grain, and I have sewn them together at a 1/2 inch seam allowance, partially sewn here and here, opened out my seam and pressed my seam allowance flat, press my seam nice and flat on the ironing board, just to simulate a seam that may have ripped or torn or split open. So it's sewn here and open here in the middle. I'm going to show you a couple of stitches to fix up this tear in the middle. The first one we'll look at is the whip stitch. I have a needle and thread, so I've got a little hand sewing needle here, and I've threaded it with some red thread so you can easily see what I'm doing. And I have a tiny little knot in the end of my thread. So I'm doing a single length of thread. It's looped over the eye of my needle here, but I only have one end of the thread that I'm using to sew with because I want this to be a relatively small stitch. I'm going to go down to the bottom of my sewn sample here, and right about here where this split starts to happen, I'm going to take my needle and I'm going to place it in between my garment and the seam allowance. So right in that fold where my seam starts. So my needle is now kind of sandwiched in between the garment and the seam allowance down in there. Now when you're working on set or backstage, you may not have the time to really put the needle in through here. You can just go through the inside of the garment through both layers. But this technique is pretty good for hiding that knot. I'm going to pull my needle through, pull the thread all the way through, and now you can see my knot is anchored right there in the fold of the fabric. I've only gone through one side. You can see the thread is only coming through this one side. I haven't caught the opposite side of the seam, the broken seam yet. Let me zoom in. Okay. So I am right-handed, so I've gone through the rightmost side of the seam. If you are left-handed, you may want to go through the leftmost side of the seam, hiding your knot in between the fold of that seam right there. But now I've got my thread anchored on the right side. I'm going to go through the left side of the fabric. I'm putting my needle down beneath both layers. So if I'm actually just putting the needle in between that little slot that's open there. And I'm going to put my needle through both layers on the left-hand side. So it's going all the way through from the back all the way to the front. If I turn the seam allowance slightly on its edge, you can see I've gone through both layers of my leftmost seam allowance. That's picking up both the seam allowance on the inside of the garment and the garment outside. Notice my needle is about a 1/16 of an inch away from the fold. We want to take a tiny little stitch close to that fold. And I'm going to pull my needle all the way through. So now I've picked up the left-hand side of my seam. Got my knot anchored on the right side, and I've picked up the leftmost side of my seam. Now a whip stitch is going to be pretty quick, similar to the hand overcast stitch. To continue the rest of this, I'm going to take my sample, my muslin sample, and I'm just going to fold my fabric like this so that both of the folds of this split open seam are kind of sitting on a mountain fold up towards me. So you can see just kind of pulling both up towards me so that I can see both of the folded edges of this seam. While holding these two folded edges, I'm going to take my needle again, and I'm going to go through both folds. I'm going to pick up everything from the right side of the sample all the way to the left side of the sample. Again, about a 1/16 of an inch away from that folded edge, going through both sides, both the right and left side of that seam. And I'm going to pull my thread through, and I'm just going to allow the thread to wrap itself over those folded edges. Similar to the hand overcast, I'm moving up about 1/8 of an inch for each stitch. Again, going through both sides, 1/16 of an inch away from the fold, and pull that through. So it's 2 stitches. Show you one more time. Putting the needle about a 1/16 of an inch away from those folded edges, going through both sides at once. I'm going from right to left, right to left, right to left. If you were left-handed, you might be going left to right, left to right, left to right. And you can see how the stitches are just kind of wrapping over the edge, similar to the hand overcast stitch. So I will continue working my way up my sample. Trying to keep my stitches as uniform as possible. Now, if you're really using this whip stitch on a garment while you're backstage or on set, it's not going to be as pretty as this. It's going to be much faster. But what's important to note is by keeping your stitches uniform, going in the same direction every time, right to left, right to left, right to left, or if you're left-handed, left to right, left to right, left to right, you end up with this overcast stitch that kind of whips itself around the edges of your fabric. Remember to work with a single length of thread. The whip stitch, especially for garment repair, tends to be quite visible because it is visible on the outside of the garment. This is a good stitch to do if you're repairing a seam while the garment is still on the wearer. So you don't have to necessarily remove the garment. You can just fix it up right there on the front of the garment. So you would want to use a thread that matches the garment or costume. And by making it a relatively visible seam repair, we want to reduce the visibility as much by using a single length of thread rather than a double length of thread. I'm getting near the end of my opened seam. I'm just going to open this up just to take a look. Yeah, looks like we're pretty much done. And as I get to the end of my work here, I'll take one more little whip stitch in the same spot. Notice I came out in the same place that I just finished that last stitch. And then I'll take a tiny stitch in my fabric, just a few little threads. And as I pull my thread through, before that loop disappears, I'm going to put my needle through the loop and pull it through to create a knot to anchor my work. Trim the excess and open it back out. And that is the whip stitch. You can see no more gapping, no more holes in the garment. The whip stitch, as I said, is good for repairing something while a garment is still on the wearer. You can just pull the 2 seam allowances up and just whip, 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 whip all the way through. Stitch, stitch, stitch all the way up, put a little knot in it, done. Send it back on out. but it is visible. You can see those stitches very prominently on the outside of the garment. You can see tinier little stitches on the inside of the garment. It also causes the seam to kind of lift ever so slightly by folding the fabric up like this. It will cause the seams to kind of butt up against each other and create a little bit of a ridge down the length of it. It's not quite as noticeable here, but you can feel it, that it pulls the stitching up ever so slightly. But that concludes the whip stitch seam repair. Make sure to label your sample correctly. And then we'll take a look at one other type of seam repair.